In the last few videos of this series, we have been following the path of water through the ancient structure modern mankind calls the Great Pyramid to better understand the water pumping process. We will continue to follow the water movement through the Queen's and King's chambers and how water exited the Great Pyramid water pumping structure. In the previous video of this series, the 4 phases of the Grand Gallery was explained. There was a lot going on in the Grand Gallery, including electrolysis, combustion, vacuum, the opening and closing of valves, and the movement of water. We saw how water was moved higher in the Grand Gallery by 2 forces acting in unison. These forces were vacuum above the water in the Grand Gallery, drawing water up, and the lower pump pushing additional water into the Grand Gallery, raising the water level of this chamber. Then a valve is opened to break the vacuum above the water in the Grand Gallery, and another valve is opened, allowing the gargantuan water piston in the Grand Gallery to travel back down, pushing water into the horizontal passage and into the Queen's chamber with tremendous pressure. The horizontal passage connects the bottom of the Grand Gallery and the Queen's chamber. A notable feature of the horizontal passage is the step near the Queen's chamber. Many have pondered the purpose of this step. We offer the interpretation that this step is the location of a one-way check valve. This check valve allowed water to move from the Grand Gallery through the check valve and into the Queen's chamber, but not back through the check valve from the Queen's chamber back into the Grand Gallery. Let's look at the horizontal passage and the Queen's chamber in more detail. Here is a diagram of the interior passages and chambers of the Great Pyramid. We will be focusing on the Queen's chamber and the horizontal passage. There is a step in the horizontal passage. This is the location of the check valve. This valve allowed water to enter the Queen's chamber from the Grand Gallery when the water piston moved down. This check valve stopped water from moving from the Queen's chamber back into the horizontal passage. Now that we have seen how the check valve in the horizontal passage functioned, we will see what happens with the introduction of water. The pressure gauge indicates the relative pressure in the Queen's chamber. Water entering the Queen's chamber compresses the air in this chamber to a high pressure. The check valve closes, preventing water from moving back into the horizontal passage. The massive water piston traveling down the Grand Gallery cylinder is the power stroke of the upper pump built into the pyramid structure. When the water piston moves down, water is forced through the horizontal passage, past the check valve, and into the Queen's chamber. Before the power stroke, the Queen's chamber is about half full of water, and the upper portion is filled with air. The power stroke forces additional water into the Queen's chamber, which compresses the air in this chamber to a high pressure. As soon as the pressure of the air in the Queen's chamber is compressed to the maximum that the water piston can achieve, water movement stops and the check valve in the horizontal passage closes. This check valve stays closed as the Grand Gallery sequences through its 4 phases until the next power stroke occurs. After the power stroke occurs, the Queen's chamber is about 3/4 full of water, and the air in this chamber is highly compressed. The check valve in the horizontal passage is closed. What happens next in the Queen's chamber? Where does the water go? The water can't possibly go into the Queen's chamber vents. The vents in the Queen's chamber were sealed at the bottom ends, and no water or air or anything could travel through these vents. The upper ends of the Queen's chamber vents are blocked off as well, so the water could not and did not travel through these vents during the water pumping process. So where did the water go? And what happened next? The Queen's Chamber does have a remarkable feature. Although covered up with concrete in modern times, there was a hole in the floor in the Queen's Chamber. This roughly excavated hole was created in distant antiquity, and the perpetrator of this damage is unknown. Who damaged the floor in this chamber is not as interesting to me as what was the motivation to excavate a hole in the floor of the Queen's Chamber. Why was it done? Was there something that caught the eye of the despoilers to cause them to damage the floor in this manner? Was there something that prompted someone long ago to cause this damage? I contend there was a small hole in the floor of the Queen's Chamber which was created by the original builders. This hole was an opening that prompted the despoilers in ancient times to dig into this area in search of treasure or artifacts that they could trade for a goat or two. Although it is quite controversial, this opening was one end of a vent in the floor of the Queen's Chamber. This vent went from the floor of the Queen's Chamber and traveled up to and terminated at the floor of the King's Chamber. The Queen's Chamber floor is connected to the King's Chamber floor through a small vent-like passage. The King's Chamber has a similar crude excavation in its floor. Again, it appears that someone in distant antiquity damaged the King's Chamber floor in a comparable manner to the Queen's Chamber floor. The opening in the floor of the King's Chamber prompted people in distant antiquity to dig in this area, which damaged the end of this vent. It seems that both ends of this controversial vent-like passage were damaged in the same way for a similar reason. Research indicates there was a movable stone component that acted like the flapper of a check valve in the floor of the King's Chamber. This check valve allowed water to move up through the vent from the Queen's Chamber floor, up through the check valve in the King's Chamber floor, and into the King's Chamber. This check valve would automatically open and shut and would not allow water to travel back down the vent. Both of the ends of this vent have been covered up and sealed in modern times using concrete. In that the evidence is covered up, this controversial interpretation of the existence of a vent between the floors of the King's and Queen's chambers cannot be absolutely confirmed or absolutely ruled out. The Queen's chamber is mostly full of water, and the air is compressed to a high pressure. Where does the water go? Water cannot go into the Queen's chamber vents because they are blocked off. The compressed air moves water into the vent in the floor, and water is moved up the vent, past the check valve in the floor of the King's chamber, and into the King's chamber. This is accomplished using the vent between the floor of the Queen's chamber, which leads up to the floor of the King's chamber. The gauges indicate the relative pressures in the Queen's and King's chamber. The power stroke in the Grand Gallery moves water into the Queen's chamber, compressing the air in this chamber. After the power stroke fills the Queen's chamber, the check valve in the horizontal passage closes. The compressed air in the Queen's chamber pushes water through the vent in the floor of the Queen's chamber and up into the King's chamber, past the check valve in the floor of the King's chamber. This additional water added into the King's chamber compresses the air in this chamber. The compressed air in the King's chamber pushes water through both of the King's chamber vents and up and out of the Great Pyramid structure. It is fascinating to watch the water pumping process as water moves through the Great Pyramid structure. The original builders were geniuses. Next, we will view what is happening in the King's chamber as water moves up through the vent that connects the floors of the King's and Queen's chambers, in that this is a continuous process and that there is always pressure in the King's chamber. The output of the Great Pyramid water pump is continuous. This is in stark contrast to the lower pump's output, which is pulsating. Compressed air in the queen's chamber pushes water into the vent in the floor of the queen's chamber. Water is pushed through this vent, up past the check valve in the floor of the king's chamber, and into the king's chamber. This additional water entering the king's chamber compresses the air in this chamber. The compressed air in the king's chamber pushes water into the king's chamber vents and up through these vents. There is always pressure in the king's chamber, so the output of the Great Pyramid water pump through the king's chamber vents is relatively steady. Therefore, water is always moving through the two king's chamber vents during the Great Pyramid water pump's operation. The antechamber remains closed until a specific event occurs. The purpose of the antechamber will be described in a later video. Here is another view of the water movement in the king's chamber. Water enters the king's chamber through the vent and past the check valve. This additional water compresses the air in the king's chamber. The compressed air in the king's chamber pushes water into and up the two king's chamber vents. Water exits the king's chamber water pump through the upper ends of the king's chamber vents. The original builders created the monumental structure called the Great Pyramid to be a water pumping machine to provide prosperity to the civilization which built this structure. The Great Pyramid was functioning infrastructure built to improve the lives of those who conceived and created this wonder of the world. The arrangement of the king's and queen's chambers are similar to a triple expansion marine steam engine. In this type of engine, the expansive force of the steam is utilized 3 times in successively larger cylinders. The force of the highly compressed air in the smaller queen's chamber is in effect reused in the larger king's chamber. Also, this arrangement of the king's and queen's chambers add additional height to the output of the pumped water in the Great Pyramid water pump. This inherent efficiency built into the design of the Great Pyramid water pump speaks volumes of the sophistication and brilliance of the minds of those who created this masterpiece of engineering. How interesting it is that the vents of the king's chamber exit this chamber relatively low in the walls. This is necessary for the water pump to operate. If the vents exited high in the walls or from the ceiling, there could not be an air cushion in the upper portion of the king's chamber. This interpretation is consistent with the evidence the Great Pyramid provides. The king's chamber vents are not to view the stars because there are bends in the vents. Bends in the vents are okay because the purpose of these vents is to transfer water through them. The direct physical evidence is consistent with the interpretation of the Great Pyramid being purpose-built to be a functioning machine providing prosperity to those who invested the time, effort, and expense to build this ancient high-tech infrastructure. Yet there is so much more to discuss. Before we address the fascinating subject of how water exited the upper ends of the king's chamber vents and how the pumped water was delivered to the point of use, we will discuss the water pumping process in greater detail. In the previous videos of this series, we have followed the path water took through the Great Pyramid water pump. In the subsequent video, we will discuss the operation of the upper pump in much more detail, describing how the features of the interior of the Great Pyramid are consistent with the interpretation of the Great Pyramid being a water pump. In this in-depth analysis, we will provide the answers to the following questions. Air is soluble in water, so how were the king's and queen's chambers kept from becoming waterlogged? What were the queen's chamber vents for? How was the hydrogen-oxygen gases ignited at the proper time? How were the electrolysis plates turned on and off at the proper time? How were the electrolysis plates powered? What were the 2 grooves high in the Grand Gallery for? How were the non-automatic valves in the Grand Gallery opened and closed at the proper time and duration? And how was all of this accomplished and still be consistent with the direct physical evidence? Those important questions will be addressed in the following video in this series about the Great Pyramid water pump. After that, we will discuss how water was delivered to the point of use, how water was made available to the Great Pyramid, and how the pumped water was used to provide prosperity for the people who built their masterpiece, which we call the Great Pyramid.